Welcome to the short history of the North British Locomotive Company. The NBLC was formed in 1903, but its roots lie back in the 1830s. At the time of its creation in 1903, the North British Locomotive Company, based in Glasgow, was the second largest loco builder in the world, with 7,500 staff and capable of building 600 locomotives a year. The largest loco manufacturer at the time was the Baldwin Locomotive Works in Pennsylvania. But let's go back to the beginning. Neilson and Company. Born in 1819, Walter Neilson was the son of James Beaumont Neilson, who invented the hot blast furnace in 1828. Walter Neilson trained as an engineer and took over the running of the family business in 1843. Called Neilson and Mitchell at the time, the company was based in Hyde Park Street, near the River Clyde in Glasgow. Having previously built marine and stationary steam engines, the company started to make steam locomotives for local railways. In 1855, the company changed its name to Neilson and Company, and in 1861 moved to a new factory in Springburn in Glasgow, the famous Hyde Park Works. Henry Dubbs had been made a partner in Neilson and Company in 1858. But in 1863 he fell out with Walter Neilson and left to set up his own locomotive works. And I'll come back to Henry Dubbs presently. Neilson and Company concentrated mainly on tank engines in its 40-year life for UK, Indian and other railways. They also built tender locos, including the first 260 locomotives in the UK for the Great Eastern Railway in 1879. James Reid became a partner in Neilson and Company around the time that Henry Dubbs left. In 1884, James Reid and Walter Neilson fell out, and Walter Neilson left to form a new company, the Clyde Locomotive Company, which I'll come to soon. That left James Reid in sole charge of Neilson and Company, although he didn't change the company's name until 1898, when he renamed it Neilson Reid and Company. Fierce competition from large locomotive manufacturers in the United States began to affect the business and finances of Neilson Reid and Company. Finally, in 1903, the company merged with Dubbs and Company and Sharp Stewart and Company to form the North British Locomotive Company, which, as I said, became the second largest locomotive company in the world. Before I explore the development of the North British Locomotive Company in the 20th century, let's go back to another of those founding companies. Dubbs and Company. Henry Dubbs was born in Germany in 1816 and qualified as an engineer there. In 1842 he moved to England and became the works manager of the Vulcan Foundry near Warrington in England. Although not called the Vulcan Foundry Company until 1847, the company had manufactured steam locomotives since the 1830s. Vulcan continued to build locos right up until 1970, being successful with both steam locomotives and, from the late 1920s, electric and diesel locomotives. Vulcan built the famous Class 55 Deltic diesel electrics, as well as Class 20, 37, 40 and 50 locos. In the 1960s it built Class 86 electrics. Anyway, back to Henry Dubbs. He didn't stay long at Vulcan and moved to Bayer Peacock and Company in the mid-1840s. Bayer Peacock also manufactured locomotives and continued into the 1960s. From 1908, the company had sole British rights for the articulated Garrett steam locomotives, which they later produced as Bayer Garrett. More than 1,000 locomotives of the Garrett design were built by the company up to 1958. In the 1950s, Bayer Peacock also built diesel hydraulic locomotives for the Great Western Railway. However, these were not successful and the company ended locomotive manufacture in the early 1960s. Henry Dubbs left Bayer Peacock in 1857 and became a partner at Neilson and Company in Glasgow. Dubbs and Walter Neilson did not get on, and Henry Dubbs left Neilson and Company in 1863, moving to the south side of Glasgow to set up his own locomotive factory at Polmadie. Several of the Neilson staff and customers moved to the new Dubs and Company. It's also reputed to be the first company to employ women in its design and drawing office from 1866. Henry Dubs himself died of cancer in 1876, but the company continued and was successful. It concentrated on tank engines, but also made traction engines and steam cranes. Increasing competition drove it to become one of the founding partners of the North British Locomotive Company in 1903. The Dubs and Company Polmadie works were sited near Govan Hill on the south side of Glasgow. Today the site is occupied by industrial units next to the M74 motorway. The Clyde Locomotive Company. As I mentioned earlier, Walter Neilson left the company that bore his name in 1884 and, at the age of 65, set up the Clyde Locomotive Company. His factory was across the tracks from the Hyde Park works of Neilson and Company. In 1888, Walter Neilson sold out to the long-established engineering firm of Sharp, Stewart and Company, who moved to Glasgow from Manchester. They renamed the Springburn factory the Atlas Works. The Clyde Locomotive Company had built only 5 locos. Walter Neilson died in 1889, aged 69. Sharp, Stewart and Company. Sharp, Stewart and Company was formed out of Sharp, Roberts and Company, which was created in Manchester in 1828. Sharp, Roberts and Company built some stationary engines and then, in 1833, built the locomotive Experiment for the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. However, Experiment was not successful and was withdrawn after a few months. Charles Beyer joined the firm in 1834 as a draftsman, and he designed a 222 loco that drove the success of the company. Around 600 of these locomotives were built by the company up to 1857. Sharp, Roberts and Company became Sharp Brothers and Company in 1843, when one of its founders, Richard Roberts, left the firm. The company changed its name again in 1852 to Sharp, Stewart and Company, when Charles Stewart became a partner. Charles Beyer left Sharp, Stewart and Company in 1853, having failed to become a partner in the business. He went on to form Beyer, Peacock and Company in 1854 with Richard Peacock. Sharp, Stewart and Company continued to expand and began to outgrow its site in Manchester. In 1888, the company took over the Clyde Locomotive Company in Springburn and renamed its factory Atlas Works. Having built over 5,000 engines, Sharp, Stewart and Company merged with Dubs and Company and Neilson Reid and Company to form the North British Locomotive Company in 1903. Hyde Park Works and Atlas Works, Springburn. The Neilson and Company Hyde Park Works and the Sharp and Stewart Atlas Works were located almost next to each other in Springburn, Glasgow. Both are now long gone. The old Ordnance Survey maps shown are available on the National Libraries of Scotland website at maps.nls.ac. The North British Locomotive Company. The newly formed North British Locomotive Company had 3 factories in Glasgow: the Hyde Park Works of Neilson Reid and Company, the Atlas Works of Sharp, Stewart and Company, and the former Dubs and Company factory in Polmadie. At this time, Glasgow was a major centre of locomotive and carriage manufacture. As well as the North British Locomotive Company, the famous St Rolloch's Works had been established in Springburn in the 1850s by the Caledonian Railway, and it built locomotives, carriages and wagons. St Rolloch's finally closed in 2019. Also in Springburn was the Cowlairs Works, established in 1841 for the North British Railway. It also built locomotives, carriages and wagons, and closed in 1968. By 1907, the North British Locomotive Company employed 8,000 people producing locos for railways across the world. In 1918, it produced a prototype tank. but the end of the First World War meant it never went into production. For nearly 50 years, the NBLC built steam locomotives for customers in Australia, China, France, Japan, New Zealand and elsewhere. It was highly successful, but the end of the steam age marked the start of the company's decline. The NBLC built a diesel shunter for British Railways in 1950, and then some diesel hydraulic locos for foreign customers. Later in the 1950s, it built diesel locos for British Railways to a German design, including Class 21, 22 and 41. However, their quality was not good and they were penalised by British Railways. The North British Locomotive Company also built electric locos to a GEC design for South African railways in the 1950s. In the 1960s, it built 25 kilovolt electrics for the newly electrified West Coast Main Line. However, again, quality problems led to poor reliability and warranty claims. Quality problems and the consequent warranty claims resulted in financial problems for the NBLC, and the company went into liquidation in 1962. Approximately 2,600 people were employed by the company at that time. All of the NBLC diesel and electric locomotives were withdrawn from service after short lifespans. The Great Railway Works in Springburn. By the late 1800s, Springburn had become one of the world centres of locomotive manufacture, with 4 great railway works. Cowlairs Works was owned by the North British Railway, St Rollox was operated by the Caledonian Railway, and then there were 2 of the North British Locomotive Company works, Hyde Park Works, formerly of Neilson and Company, and Atlas Works, formerly of Sharp, Stewart and Company. The NBLC's Polmadie Works was approximately 4 miles to the south. Also in Springburn was the St Rollox Chemical Works, established by Charles Tennant in 1799, and by the 1830s was the largest chemical works in the world. By the late 1800s, the main product of the site was sulphuric acid. Charles Tennant had been a sponsor of the Garnkirk and Glasgow Railway, opened in 1831, and the first railway in Scotland to use steam locomotives in regular service. Its first engine, introduced in June 1831, was aptly named St Rollox and was built by Robert Stephenson and Company in Newcastle. The Atlas Works site in Springburn is now an industrial park, while the Hyde Park Works site is occupied by the North Glasgow College. The site of the factory in Polmadie is now occupied by a variety of businesses. And there ends the story of the North British Locomotive Company. Its end was inauspicious, with poor workmanship and poor materials bringing financial ruin. But its early history is one which links several of the most important locomotive manufacturing companies in the world. It is a rich and interesting history. Thank you for watching this video. Goodbye.